Going to begin our program this evening with Lift Every Voice and Sing, followed by a welcome by the Dean, Dr. Stan Gerson of the School of Medicine. Won't you please welcome Andreen Priest, who's going to lead us in Lift Every Voice and Sing. Won't you please stand?
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening signs. Let it sound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has brought us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. God of our wearies, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on our way, thou who hast by thy might led us unto the light. Keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land.
What an incredible way to start a tradition. So thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful and transformative. Needless to say, for our first inaugural, now 2022 School of Medicine Martin Luther King Jr. and Black History Month address, we have a great deal to learn, to reflect on, to reconsider in the area of community interactions across the expanse of racial and ethnic diversity and humanity. And perhaps the field of calling of medicine asks us to do even more than others. A day does not go by when some of us are confused, assaulted, confronted with the need to reconsider our approaches, our ability to interact with others, our individual and collective biases, boundaries of comfort and confusion. That's why being able to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and to learn more during Black History Month is so important. All of us individualize such experiences and approaches. For me, racial differences first came when I was a young child in a liberal western suburb of Boston. Very little diversity, little religious diversity, my family, followed by a school busing program into our city. This is Boston, after all. Marches for civil rights. In that suburb, we rarely learned about the Civil War. We were interested in the Revolutionary War. We didn't get that far in history. So even I had to relearn that for the first time when I was in college and after. And right now, I'm witnessing back at the college that I graduated from the struggle that they're having, not removing the name of past president of the university, and the House dormitory, he was named because he was clearly a racist and an anti-Semitic in many of his writings and followings. But we have much to learn, much to re-examine as we attempt to improve our inclusive culture and learn from this. After I heard that Dean Voison was becoming our incoming dean for the Mendel School of Applied Social Sciences, I sat down and read his book over the weekend, and it was provocative, an examination of the roots of violence among the vibrant souls of Chicago's Black youth, and gave clarity about how complex solutions come slowly. Here to introduce Dean Voison is Dr. Blanton Tolbert, professor of chemistry and an accomplished RNA investigator with an incredible track record in training junior colleagues and connecting nationally to help develop and sustain a diverse and equitable scientific community of like-minded, brilliant individuals. Dr. Tolbert received his PhD at the University of Rochester, was an HHMI postdoctoral fellow in the University of Maryland, an assistant professor at Miami University, and then moved here, I believe in 2013, as a Department of Chemistry. Recently, last fall, he accepted the position of Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Excellence for the School of Medicine, and he has been developing a wide range of programs to support equity across our school, faculty, students. Dr. Tolbert.
First of all, I want to start off by thanking Dean Gerson for the opportunity and the support of this very first inaugural MLK and Black History Month celebration. And I'd also like to thank all of you who are attending in person and virtually. So it is a real pleasure of mine to introduce our speaker today, Dexter Voison, who is the Jack Joseph and Morton Mendel Dean in Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. So I've gotten to know, going off script here just a little bit, I've gotten to know Dexter over the past few weeks quite well and interacting with him and preparing for this, and it's been a real pleasure to actually have the opportunity to sit down and chat with him and get to know more about his background and some of his passions. So before coming here, Dexter was Dean of the Factor Inwatash Faculty of Social Work and the Sandra Rotman Endowed Chair in Social Work at the University of Toronto. He also held a full professor appointment at the University of Chicago for 2 decades and was the director and co-director of the STI-HIV Intervention Network at Chicago Center for HIV Elimination, and the Chicago Center for HIV Elimination at the University of Chicago. So Dean Voison's research examines how structural racial violence and interpersonal violence impact health behaviors and outcomes among minority populations. He has authored more than 170 peer-reviewed publications and secured more than $11 million in funding for the National Institutes of Health, and the W.T. Grant Foundation. His research has informed health policy in the state of Illinois, and he was appointed to 2 Illinois state boards by Governor Quinn. So in addition, he is a board member of the Society for Social Work and Research and a fellow of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, so he's quite accomplished. Dean Voison earned his PhD and Master's in Philosophy from Columbia University and a Master's in Social Work from the University of Michigan. And of course, someone with a resume as lengthy as his, he's been quoted both nationally and internationally by the media. Dexter Voison's latest project is America the Beautiful and Violent, Black Youth and Neighborhood Trauma in Chicago, and that was published by Columbia University Press in 2019. And like Dean Gerson, I haven't finished reading the book, but I'm making my way through it, and it will hold your attention for sure. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dexter Voison. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank Dean Gerson and Dr. Talbot for this opportunity to be in conversation. And it's so nice to actually see 3-dimensional folks in the room when you're giving a talk. I can't tell you how wonderful that is. And I'd also like to welcome the other 240 plus folks who've signed on and are joining us online. So I'm a clinical social worker by training who stumbled into the academy, became a researcher, educator, and administrator. And I have the deep and uttermost respect for all the healing professions. So I want to thank all of the folks who are working in these and other professions to advance health equity and inclusion, particularly during the COVID pandemic. So I want to start off by saying thank you. Before moving into our conversation, I would like to start with our land acknowledgement. And this is the university's land acknowledgement. And I'm starting off with it for a couple of reasons, one of which it acknowledges our colonial settler history. And that is a history that has continued to influence social work, healthcare delivery and systems in the United States, some of which I'll touch briefly on during our conversation. So in recognizing the land upon which we reside, we express our gratitude and deep appreciation to those who lived and worked here before us, those whose stewardship and resilient spirit makes our residence possible on the traditional homeland of the Lenape, the Swanee, the Wyandot, Miami, Ottawa, and other Great Lake tribes. We also acknowledge the thousands of Native Americans who now call Northeast Ohio home. We recognize the many persons who came to this land voluntarily and involuntarily. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work, study, and learn on this land. So as healthcare providers, we very much focus on the doing, making a difference. How do we move the dial? And this talk is structured around 5 main tenets. And I think it's really important to sort of situate our personal and professional identities before we do this work, because very often, if we don't do that and we're eager to act, we can act and sometimes unintentionally cause harm. We can act and sometimes maintain the status quo inadvertently. We can act and we can see little to no results. So it's really important to situate our identities as we come to any work, particularly our professional careers, and especially those among vulnerable populations. I'm going to talk a little bit about Black traumas and healthcare utilization. And I'm going to posit that maybe some of the reasons why we have not seen the kind of healthcare gains we anticipate and we are working towards is because we haven't given adequate attention to the impact of traumas. I'm going to talk a little bit about what does it mean to have an inclusive paradigm. And now in the academy, some of the buzzwords are including partners, community partners as equals. what does that look like? Is that actually possible? Could we actually come to the table as equals? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about our colonial settler ideologies, which I've been socialized to, which I've promoted in my own research. And I've come now, after almost 30 years, to see how I promoted some of that unintentionally in my own research, and how I've had to unlearn some of that in order to more effectively work alongside community partners. And then I'm going to offer a few points around advancing health equity. And I hope we're going to have a lively conversation with some questions at the end. So particularly for the folks online, please send your questions in. So situating identities. So if I were to invite everyone in this room and online to look through these windows or these peepholes and describe a very large room behind you, everyone would probably look into the room and have a portion of what they see that's accurate but probably incomplete. And as much as we try, we can only see what the gaze allows us to visualize. And I use this as a metaphor to really talk about, in order to work alongside and in conjunction with communities, we need multiple folks looking through different vantage points of these keyholes. So it calls for an interdisciplinary perspective, but more importantly, it calls for our community partners to be part of that gaze. Because they're on the other side of the room looking back, and they can tell us things that we cannot see looking from the outside in. So my identities, full disclosure, and as I say, I situate this work based on personal identities. So I was born in the West Indies, and I spent my late adolescence, young adult, and later on in the United States, worked in Canada, lived in Canada for a few short years. And I've had to now have a comparative example navigating Black identity and Blackness through these three very different cultural contexts. And believe me, they are different, being Black in the Caribbean, being Black in America, and being Black in Canada. Very, very different. And we grew up in a working class family with parents who had middle class values, who stressed education. And as the last of three, I was always trying to find my voice, being overlooked as the youngest. So I became an overachiever. And one of the ways I overachieved is in terms of education, to get the access, to get the acknowledgement of my parents and my older siblings. So I was the first in my college, in my family, to attend college, and the first to attend graduate school. All my education has been in predominantly white institutions, top-tier institutions, and all my work has been primarily in Black communities. And I'll talk a little bit about the sort of dichotomy in terms of bridging those and the lessons that I've learned. And all of you come to this work, all of us come to this work with our own individual identities, and I'll invite all of you to just briefly reflect on that as I go through this talk. So many of the lessons that I'm going to talk about today are lessons that I learned alongside communities over the past almost 30 years, working on projects, the lessons many of these community members taught me, some of the failures that I made along the way, and I call that failing forward, some of the failures that I made along the way. And that helped me to shed some insight as I continue to learn, relearn, and unpack some of the approaches for working alongside and in conjunction with communities. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of trauma and structural trauma, structural violence. And this is a quote from Paul Farmer, who is a medical anthropologist. And he talks about violence can never be understood in terms of a physical force alone. Violence also includes the assaults on the personhood, dignity, sense of worth, the value of the victim, the social and cultural dimensions of violence, which are what gives violence its power and meaning. So this whole notion of structural violence. So we move from the basement in terms of looking at our identities, now onto the first floor in terms of really sort of conceptualizing structural violence. I think very often in the West we think about violence as a physical punch, a kick, a slap. But I want to expand our notion of violence around the daily constraints around Black lives. And we're talking about Black History Month, so I'm going to focus primarily on the experience of Black Americans. So the daily constraints on Black lives, the daily constraints on the possibilities, on the imagination, on the forces that lead individuals and communities to walk in the daze, to sometimes feel excluded from society, right? So when we talk about structural violence, it's important, I think, very often as healthcare providers, we look a lot at disparities. So we look at the disparities research. So disparities research typically focuses on health problems faced by people of color and neglects the structures and colonial practices and institutions that create these problems. So when I started off my research, I was looking at disparities in STI rates among Black and white adolescents. And I realized that just looking at that alone kept adding to a narrative of Black deficits. Because I wasn't getting to the why. Why is that taking place? What are the structures? So I'm looking at deficits, I'm looking at outcomes, but I really needed to pull the lens back and look at community context, look at neighborhood factors. A parallel to that is folks who do educational research. Very often, they look at the gaps in terms of educational attainment, but not the gaps in educational funding, which are very often the drivers of these factors. So we look at healthcare utilization, but how does trauma influence healthcare utilization? So my research started with adolescents, but I got calls from folks from Mount Sinai in Chicago saying, we are noticing that pregnant women who are living in high violent neighborhoods are not keeping their appointments. Right? What is this connection? So again, looking at structures and not just the outcome. And I propose that continuing to look at the outcome without looking at the why behind that further perpetuates a narrative of deficits, right? And all these foci or lack of foci can influence practice, policy, funding, right? So the questions we ask, how we ask them, has real significant consequences for many of these populations. So it's really important, again, to pull the lens back and start looking at the why, looking at the structures. So these are some of the structures, some of the social determinants of health, and some of the factors that we need to address in order to promote health equity. But they're also the factors that disproportionately affect Black Americans. So we know that the United States is the most influential and powerful country in the nation, but yet at the same time, we have the highest child-infant mortality rate among all industrialized countries. How is that possible? We have the highest rate of preventable sexually transmitted infections among adolescents. How is that possible? We have the highest rate of child poverty among all G8 industrialized countries. How is that possible? And it's possible because the burden of disease is borne disproportionately by Black Americans. So James Baldwin captures this quite eloquently when he talks about America, and he says, America's history is more varied, more beautiful, more violent than anything anyone has ever written about her. And he talks about the Negro child growing up in the shadows of the Stars and Stripes. Bill Clinton says the communities that have not been touched by America's prosperity. So when we talk about a city, a shining city sitting on a hill, we're talking about really two very different experiences. So I'm going to show a video here that I think captures some of the hesitancy that Black Americans have relative to the healthcare engagement and utilization. And this is not just low-income Black Americans. These are also Black Americans from every socioeconomic grouping.
Do you trust your doctors? You don't think they'd ever use you as a guinea pig or withhold treatment for a life-threatening disease. just for science. Do you?
Hell yeah.
It turns out in the US, trust in medicine varies significantly by race. African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be suspicious of doctors.
Second opinion, please.
About 50% believe conspiracy theories about HIV, and they have good reason to be suspicious. But studies show that mistrust of medicine can be bad for your health.
Walk it off. You're fine.
So, how do we draw the line between being prudent and paranoid? African Americans are 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with HIV as the rest of the country. There are a lot of reasons for that.
Institutionalized system of inequality.
Access and insurance.
Stigma.
But one reason that isn't talked about much is trust.
Talking with people in the community very early in the epidemic was a difficult conversation because there were rumors.
The government lied about inventing the HIV virus as a means of genocide.
They ain't cure that because ain't no money in the cure. The money's in the medicine. That's how you get paid.
These ideas might sound paranoid to some, but for many African Americans, mistrust of doctors has deep roots, and they were planted by real historical conspiracies.
The Tuskegee Study took place in Tuskegee, Alabama, with African American men who had syphilis to, quote unquote, figure out the natural course of the disease.
These men were promised that they would be cared for, they would be given free medical treatment.
But they were never treated as anything but guinea pigs.
10 years after a cure was found for syphilis, and medical treatment was withheld from these men. So it resulted not only in the man dying from syphilis, but also their wives contracting congenital syphilis. And this experiment continued for 40 years, until a whistleblower brought it to the whole attention of the public, and then the experiment was shut down.
That sounds like a prototypical conspiracy theory, this shady experiment that was put on by the government, which involved people's health and keeping important information from them. But it's absolutely true. That's documented. That happened.
When you have like your grandfather telling you about growing up in Alabama and how like, you know, the white doctors did A, B, and C, automatically in your brain, you're going to be thinking like, I can't trust these people, you know?
It's not just an isolated incident. It's really an institutionalized system of inequality.
Henrietta Lacks, samples being taken unbeknownst to you.
African Americans being used in dissections, unauthorized uses of their bodies.
The American Medical Association found that even after controlling for income and education, African Americans were offered subsistence services, more outdated drugs, more harsh drugs, and are offered more harsher diagnoses compared to their white counterparts. So when you talk about levels of mistrust, is it paranoia or is it self-care?
Then, less than a decade after Tuskegee, a mysterious new disease started ravaging several marginalized groups, including African Americans.
Mysterious, it's deadly, and it's baffling medical science.
Number of AIDS cases passed the 100,000 mark.
Black people were disproportionately impacted from the very beginning.
It was perfect conspiracy fodder.
Something's not right here. What I'm saying, it was targeted.
So some psychologists talk about an idea called prudent paranoia. And this is the idea that it might be a good idea to be mildly suspicious most of the time, because people don't always have our best interests in mind. When you look at the history of institutionalized racism in the United States, it begins to make sense why African Americans might be more receptive to certain conspiracy theories.
This sort of embodies a larger level of mistrust that was happening for decades.
So I don't put anything past the American government when it comes to people of color in this country. I'm sorry.
We all experience prudent paranoia from time to time. If someone does you wrong, you watch your back. When we experience a history of conspiracy,
Well, I'm not a crook.
we begin to expect it. We become hyper-vigilant, looking out for signs that someone's trying to pull one over on us. Sometimes prudent paranoia escalates into its dangerous cousin, conspiracy thinking. And that can have real consequences, especially when it comes to your health.
Rather than go to the doctor, we'll ask another man if they had the same symptoms we had. Like, hey man, does your heart ever just stop?
Sometimes it's hard to know where to draw the line between being prudent and being paranoid. Is the healthcare system in America racially biased? Yes. Are doctors spreading HIV on purpose or withholding a cure? The probability of that is harder to calculate. So we asked this mathematician. David Grimes wanted to answer an age-old question. How can we know if a conspiracy theory is true or not? So he researched several real conspiracies and how they unravel to try to determine the limits of conspiratorial behavior. When he crunched the numbers, some realities emerged.
The longer you want to keep something a secret for, the more difficult it is. The other thing you see is conspiracies are very, very difficult to sustain if you have a lot of people in them. Benjamin Franklin once said that 3 men can keep a secret if 2 are dead. This illustrates the whole phenomenon that the more people you involve, the quicker your conspiracies fail.
According to Dr. Grimes, the chances of a global, decades-long conspiracy to fake climate change or hide a cure for cancer are pretty much zero. And if it couldn't work for cancer, it probably wouldn't work for HIV either.
The idea of being able to sustain that many people for that long in a dangerous, unethical fiction, it just doesn't work when you put the numbers to it.
But here's the catch.
Just because you can, so you say, create an algorithm or whatever to kind of debunk things, I'm telling you, that pales to the strength of the human mind to believe whatever it wants.
That's the thing about conspiracy theories. If they're rooted in fear and mistrust, facts can't dispel them. We have to address the underlying causes of prudent paranoia that are real and legitimate.
The problem isn't the mistrust in the African American community, it's the lack of trustworthiness in the medical community.
So what's the antidote to mistrust? We can start by acknowledging the wrongs of our past and helping patients regain a sense of trust and control over their own health.
How are you?
Dr. Green's like a sister. I can ask her any question, and she can do the same with me.
You know me, I'm not gonna push some medicines or anything like that, but make sure whatever you're gonna do is healthy for you. The care part is what's gonna get that medicine to that patient and get the patient to be the leader and feel that autonomy.
And the most important antidote? People who are trusted members of the community you serve.
If you don't have anyone present in the community who represents the community, there's no way you're going to be a successful healthcare organization. You need to become a part of the fabric of the community, whether it's doing, flu shots at a church or, whatever vaccinations at a school. And I feel like that's where it begins with trust.
Doctors aren't the only people we have a hard time trusting in America. Our trust in government and other civic institutions is at an all-time low.
You Republicans in the House have been lying nonstop.
Democrats will defend any lawlessness.
Wherever there's mistrust, there will be conspiracy theories and consequences.
There's evidence that engaging with conspiracy theories promotes alienation. It makes people less likely to engage in pro-social behaviors, like voting. And so these are worrying effects.
Even more worrying, Americans increasingly don't trust each other. Why?
So, when I show this video, folks say, well, how is this possible? Tuskegee happened many, many years ago. How are these things still lingering? And let's look around us. So currently we have conversations around appointing a black female to the Supreme Court, and issues around competency or intellect is arising. We have issues like George Floyd. We have over-policing. We have a disproportionate number of black children in the child welfare system. So Latinx children, all other kids represented in the child welfare system relative to their proportion in the population. Only black kids are 2 times more likely to be in the child welfare system. The prison industrial complex, if blacks were incarcerated at the rate relative to their proportion in the population, the prison industrial complex would decrease by 40% overnight. So there are cues continuously around perpetuating this level of mistrust. And again, folks are seeing their experience in America very differently based on their social locations. So this is an example of fleas. And folks say, fleas? Yes, we learn a lot from insect and animal studies. But fleas are put into a glass jar, and they have a capacity to jump 18 inches. But if you put a glass jar, let's say of 7 inches high, and you keep them there for 3 days, remove the lid, guess what happens? they don't jump any higher than 7 inches, even though the lid has been removed, right? So I talk about sort of constraints, we talk about societal constraints, and the interesting factor, not only would those fleas underperform, but their offsprings would also underperform. So when clients come, Black clients come to medical systems, they're dealing with intergenerational transmission of trauma. So we look at what happened in Flint, Michigan, right? The neurological damage that happened to those kids. We are told that that not only affects those kids, but their offsprings. Dr. Claudia Colton from the Poverty Center at Mandel, she did a statewide lead study analyzing data over 20 years, right? And found similar results, that the behavioral consequences in terms of the psychosocial disruptions happen not just with those individuals, but it follows them into adulthood and beyond, and also their offsprings, right? So again, it's the notion of trauma, compounded trauma, when individuals are interacting in the healthcare system and in predominantly white spaces, right? And this whole notion of mistrust. So, well, Dr. Dexter, this is just really low-income individuals that experience this level of mistrust. This chart here shows some of the pathways where I call trauma gets under the skin. Or put another way, how race gets under the skin, right? And it talks about some of the different pathways through behavioral mechanisms, through psychological arousal, through patient-client, patient-doctor interaction, right? All these different pathways where trauma gets under the skin, but more importantly, race-related trauma gets under the skin to lead to poorer health outcomes, increased morbidity, higher disability. So my brother, who lived the American dream, migrated after I did, elevated to a really successful place in corporate America, just before the age of 49, started having symptoms, pain symptoms. Resisted going to the doctors, and we know that men in general tend not to utilize healthcare relative to women, right? For a whole host of reasons, but Black men are less likely to engage in healthcare relative to their white counterparts. So he waited about maybe 9 months before he went to the doctor. And over the period of 1.5 years, he was misdiagnosed. Pain symptoms were minimized, and we know that Blacks in general are prescribed less pain medication, and there's a whole narrative behind that. But when he was correctly diagnosed, 1.5 years later, he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, stage 4. Initially, he was told that he had rheumatoid arthritis, or that the pain was asymptomatic, that he was not really experiencing the level of pain that he was reporting, right? And we know that this is a common feature with Blacks interacting in the healthcare system, right? So it's not just something, a narrative that's renegated to low-income Blacks, also high-income. And the Institute of Medicine, again, it talks about the sort of disproportionality in care, treatment, aggressiveness around recommended services, and so on. So I want to talk a little bit, we've talked a little bit about the importance of locating your self-identity, realizing the strengths that come with that, but also the inherent limitations, acknowledging the notion of ongoing trauma with Black populations. Let's talk a little bit about what it means to have inclusive excellence, shifting to a more inclusive excellence paradigm. And this is a story which has now been proven to be false, but it's a story about a cure for smallpox. But in short, it basically says that a physician listening to the stories of milkmaids, folks who seem to be immune from smallpox, listening to their stories, observing them, developed a cure for smallpox, realizing that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox became immune to smallpox, right? Is now debunked as false. But the takeaway from this is that listening to indigenous knowledge, listening to folks within communities can bring great insights. And I started with a metaphor of the wall peeping through the peepholes and making sure that you have the people on the other side also communicating information to you, right? So I use this as a metaphor to highlight that. One of the reasons I think why our relationship or our interactions with communities are so fraught with difficulties, tensions, and sometimes ineffectiveness is what I call the colonial settler ideologies that we've all been socialized to. This notion of expert, right, recipient, priest, sinner, sufferer, saint, right? These dichotomous labels that we come up with. I was talking to a social work student and some medical students around the importance of disbanding that approach, not saying you don't have expertise, but putting yourself in the role of a consultant. And they said to me, you know, I'm not spending all this money to be a consultant. I want to be an expert, right? I'm not spending all this time in training to be a consultant, right? So we are kind of socialized to think about things in these dichotomous ways. And again, it's because of our, I think, overall socialization. We did some work in the Caribbean some years ago around transporting STI intervention network. And we had to deal with the whole issues of trust in a post-colonial society. And I talked about in the United States, we are in a colonial settler society and we live in different experiences. The whole notion of transparency, the tensions between what community members want and what researchers want. And this whole notion of what drives the inquiry, what questions drive the inquiry. So this traditionally has been the relationship with university partners to communities. It's been a top-down relationship, right? University partners acting on communities. Now we sort of shifted away from this in principle or in ideology around universities working as equal partners. And when I hear that term, I said, you know, this sounds really nice. It sounds great for like a poster, but is it really an equal relationship? And I think this is probably more what the relationship looks like. University partners come in connection with community partners, but it's never equal. Never equal in part because we are holding the purse strings in terms of the research dollars, the funding. We have the relationships to the funders. We have the relationships to the reporting mechanisms. And very often we decide what the questions will be, right? And then there are tensions to navigate in terms of communities wanting service. How is this going to benefit us? And researchers thinking about science, right? And sometimes service can be framed as science, but sometimes as researchers we have a difficulty combining the both. So I think, you know, in terms of clarity, it's not an equal relationship, and in part because those communities do not have the same resources. They have expertise, but not the same resources. Very often, too, resources have been extracted from those communities. And you know, we look at the whole notion of racial capitalization. And I use the example of Chicago. In some black neighborhoods, 70% of black men have had criminal justice involvement. And in part, it's because of over-policing in those communities. So the more contact with police, the higher rates of arrest. And that leads to more fragmentation, more single female-headed households, more kids in the child welfare system, and the cycle continues when I talk about the sort of constraint on everyday life. So these community partners are coming, but not with an equal say. And I want to suggest some ways in which we could lessen the power differential. It's never an equal power differential. We can only lessen them to some degree, and we have to be transparent about what we can do, and the power imbalance in these relationships, it never goes away, right? So I want to talk about, I talked a little bit about the sort of colonial settler ideologies and how that sometimes can be an impediment to inclusivity as well as health equity. And as I said, I've failed forward in those relationships with the type of research questions I've asked, the way I frame my results, talking with community partners who've kind of held me accountable. Even as a black man, I've participated in that sort of perpetuation of ideologies because it becomes what we call the taken for granted syndrome. And it's like the story of this senior fish and the 4 junior fish. And the senior fish sees the 4 junior fish and says, "Good morning, boys, how's the water?" And the junior fish look around and say, "Water? What water?" They've been in it for so long that they became immune to it. It no longer existed. And this is how these ideologies seep into our pedagogy, it seeps into our research, it seeps into the framing of our questions, that we all become blind to it. And it's only in interaction with communities that those scales very often becomes more apparent. Some of the most powerful lessons I've learned, some of the most influential lessons I've learned has been taking on the stance of the consultant and community members really teaching those lessons to me. And I'm learning those lessons alongside community members. So let's talk a little bit in terms of moving from performative to transformative. And when we do disparities research, that is not the same as social justice. And it took me a while to kind of figure that out. I'm doing disparities research, so I'm advancing social justice. No. Doing disparities research does not advance social justice. Providing health services is not the same as social justice. Social justice inherently signifies something that is transformative. Transformative from the standpoint of communities. That is what social justice really is. So I'll give an example of that. So working with some community partners, we had our own agenda, and we had a very sort of transparent conversation around what we could do and not do. And we asked them, "What do you want?" And they said, "Well, you know what? We want to learn this stuff about facilitation of groups. We want to learn, don't just give us a fish, teach us how to fish. We need capacity in our communities. Are there courses we can take at the university that would help us to build up our technical expertise?" Transformative is really bringing people who've been on the outskirts into the equation, into resources. One young man who I call Marcus, after spending many hours with him researching and doing some ethnographic work in the Inglewood neighborhood, he said to me, "Dr. Dexter, you know what this is all about, this whole stuff about violence?" He broke it down to one simple phrase. It's all about resources. It's all about resources. And we know from all the sociological studies that it really is about access to resources. So these are some of the steps to advancing health equity, really taking on a consultant, learner versus an expert. Doesn't mean we abandon our expertise, but it means having cultural humility and really listening and learning alongside our community partners. Very often when we look at the social determinants of health, and many of our faculty at the Mandel School and in our 9 research centers are looking at the social determinants of health, healthcare providers say, well, we assess this, but then we don't have the capacity to do anything about it. And what we found is that the patient-client, patient-provider bond is very powerful. We're doing a study now in Chicago looking at the impact of poverty, racism, police violence, neighborhood violence, and so on. And what we are finding from our participants, they're saying, I have stronger medication efficacy in terms of following through with my prescriptions, following through with my appointments, if I feel that my provider truly cares about me. If there's a bond, a sense of mutual respect, that they sometimes would find their own ways around those barriers to keep those appointments, right? And again, looking at the social determinants of health, but we have to make sure that we don't use screenings. Now folks are doing screenings in medical settings, which is great, but we have to make sure we don't use those screenings now to further police the poor, right? And in social work, we've gotten really good at that, using child risk screenings to further some of the disproportionality of black kids in the child welfare system, right? So we need to make sure when we use these screenings as a tool that we have that self-awareness on all the other things, recognizing trauma, that we don't use it to further police and inflict more trauma on these populations. All right. So the University of Toronto, which I spent some time, in 1999, out of an incoming class of 250 medical students, they had one black student admitted into the class. In 2017, they had 2 black students admitted into the class out of 250 students. Then the pipeline question or the pathway question is very often put up as an excuse, right? Then folks said, no, this can't be right. Let's change our admissions policy and create a special screening process for Black and Indigenous applicants where we have Black doctors reading these applications as well as community physicians. In 2019, the admission rate went up to 50 incoming students in a class out of 250. That is transformative. Bringing people who have the talent, who've been excluded, into opportunity, right? Those are some of the ways that we help to incrementally support and transform communities, right? By looking at our policies, looking at the research, making sure that we are not perpetuating biased research that further perpetuates bias funding, bias policies, right? Looking at our admissions policies, bringing resources, giving community members access to the rich university sources, which sometimes costs us very little, right? Authentic reciprocal relationships. When we have community partners, making sure that they're fully compensated for their time, that we just don't extract their knowledge, right, without compensation, right, or without recognition. And building community capacity, and I talked a little bit earlier about building community capacity. So one of my colleagues at the Poverty Center, Dr. Francesca, she is actually doing some work to further advance that. So, many places have community advisory boards, and I say boards with a big B or small b. Some of them are just performative, and the boards don't really have any sort of real teeth in terms of what takes place. And again, because we are holding the final decision-making around the coins, around the resources, around the reporting. But in this case, that board helps to determine what type of questions get asked in their communities. We did a study in Inglewood, one of the highest poverty-related crime communities on the south side of Chicago. And doing a focus group with those participants, they came up with the notion of future orientation. They didn't say future orientation, but one father said, I take my son once a month outside of Inglewood on the bus around other neighborhoods in Chicago because I want him to know that this is not how the rest of Chicago lives. That basically he was saying, we live in the other America. This is not how the rest of America lives. And I kept hearing this theme over and over again from participants in terms of how they were building resiliency or a sense of future hope in their kids. And I said, oh, wow, he's talking about future orientation, right? And I started looking in the literature. We put this into some of our data collection, and it turned out to be the strongest protective factor for kids, even in the face of police violence, neighborhood violence, racism, and all these other factors, right? So what Dr. Francesca is doing is actually presenting data to participants in a way where it's visual, where technical expertise does not exclude them from having a voice. So visual representation of data and asking them, what are we missing? And the community members are now taking those ideas, those constructs, and the researchers are now translating it into researchable terms, putting it into the study. When the data is collected and the findings are crunched, the community now has a say in terms of how these findings are framed and helping with the interpretation. If not, we continue to perpetuate bias deficit narratives, right? So that's one way that community members can be involved. But in order to come to the table, we have to give them to the knowledge in the academy. Let them sit in on some classes, right? Offer them training that's relevant to their interests. so that we could bridge the language gap, the communication, so we could truly benefit from their expertise. Right? And again, when we do that, we need to compensate them because they are providing expertise, right? We need to acknowledge that as real expertise. So I think particularly with gatekeepers, trusted leaders in the community, we need to build those relationships. Because academics dropping down on communities would not move the dial, right? We have to work in true partnership with these communities. Any other questions?
We have one more from the chat. How has the COVID-19 pandemic informed us and impacted this issue?
Well, it's exacerbated all the inequalities, right? So we know the data in terms of the mortality rates for blacks and so on. So it's exacerbated all these problems. But I think the takeaway is to realize that when we ignore the disproportionality in communities of need, we are all impacted, right? So COVID-19 taught us that we can't escape. And we know from population health that the greater inequality you have in society, the poorer population health. So Americans live on average 3 years less than Canadians, right? So we are all impacted, and in part because there's less inequality, particularly related to healthcare access in Canada, right? So we all pay the cost either directly or indirectly when we have these sharp inequalities in society. All right, so thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.